welcome guys to the show. It's great to have you both on the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About podcast. So for anyone that isn't familiar with my two guests, I'll let you go around and do a bit of an intro on who you guys are and what your backgrounds are. So let's start off with you, Q. What would you just give a little bit of an intro on yourself?
Yeah, hey, so I'm Q the Abolitionist. I'm one of the co-hosts of Unshackled Liberty podcast. We were going to talk a little bit about, what do you want to talk about? The Christianity and Libertarianism? Is that?
Yeah, that's the general theme. Yeah, we're kind of all on the spectrum of libertarian, I would say.
Would it be appropriate to give my background of faith, my
Absolutely.
background of politics in this? Okay, so I come from the Baptist theology of Christianity, independent Baptist specifically. I got saved. I was 16 years old. In that I've been a you're in Northern Ireland, so I don't know what all of your political affiliations are like there. But for anybody in the States who might be listening, I was a card-carrying neocon for the better part of my adult life. Recently, excuse me, sorry about that. During the 2016 presidential run, I couldn't get on board with Trump. Just couldn't do it, and of course Hillary was out, and so I started looking for other options, and then the Libertarian Party popped up, and as I studied libertarianism, I moved on from partisan politics altogether. I consider myself a voluntarist or an abolitionist now, where the dirty word is anarchist, right? Because that carries a lot of different connotations for a lot of different people, but I think it's cleaner to just say abolitionist or voluntarist. So that's kind of where I come from. That's my line. That's the road I'm on right now, and
awesome.
And I'm just appreciative of the opportunity to come onto your show and have this conversation.
Yeah, so before we move on, give us a little bit of a rundown of some of those terms that you threw out, some of the jargon. So we'll start with neocon. So anyone that doesn't know what neocon means.
So it's like a neoconservative, right? So these are your nationalists nowadays in the United States. These are the guys who are on Team Red.
Right.
Flag waving members of the Trump team, and they believe in a police state and strong borders and strong national security. And a lot of times when you look at that just kind of on its face, at least for me, I was like, well, that kind of makes sense. We want to be safe, we want to be protected, we want to have law and order and all that stuff. But when you take a deeper dive into what all that means and the stuff that you have to do to implement these policies, it's not liberty. That's
a little bit of a catch,
Yeah. So that's what got me mostly.
Okay, and then so you said as well about abolitionist and what was the other one you said? Voluntarism.
Voluntarist.
Voluntarist. So what are those two guys?
So a voluntarist is somebody who believes that all human interaction should be voluntary in nature. That the fact that, and this is a great opportunity, like you and I are having this conversation, we're having this show. If either one of us decided that we didn't want to do it, well,
we just log out. Yeah,
we just walk away, right? So, and that's the principle. So that's market economics. Those two, a buyer and a seller coming to a mutual agreement. And that's all human interaction. So, when the state is coercion, right? That's what it is. Government is coercion. They have a monopoly on force, and so all of the interaction with the state is based on the barrel of a gun. Right, okay. So that's not voluntary, right? So I kind of am I'm the opposite of that. And the word abolitionist comes from, America has a slave history, right?
Yeah.
We were a slave country, and we owned. I say we. I didn't. I never did. Yeah. I don't. But historically,
some people these days would like to tell you that you were complicit in this somehow.
Somehow, yeah. But I say we because I'm an American. This is where I'm from, and our history is such that it was common practice to own black African slaves, and actually it was common practice for a while to have Irish slaves too. It's much less publicized, but that was the norm. In fact, if I recall correctly, Irish slaves were cheaper and more disposable than African slaves when there were Irish slaves.
Right.
That's one of those things. But so the term comes from that. The abolitionist movement was to abolish slavery, and I still feel the same way, and that the state We have moved on. We have universalized slavery in the United States. Instead of having black African slaves, which was just as which was immoral. I'm not advocating for that at all. We have universalized that. So we have debt slaves and we have tax slaves, and that's what we are. We live on a tax ranch, and we are tax cattle. And so the term abolitionist or the word abolitionist is geared towards abolishing the state or abolishing the plantation owners, right? The ruling class. So,
interesting.
So awesome. That's my perspective. Sorry. Yeah. I don't know if that took a lot long.
No.
It's a pretty long introduction for you. I'm sorry.
Well, we might as well get all the stuff explained before we get fully started. Yeah. So awesome. Let's go to Kevin then. So welcome, Kevin. Give us a bit of a rundown on who you are and what you're all about.
Absolutely. Well, so first off, thank you for having me on. And I have to say I agree with a lot of what Q had to say there. As far as my history goes, I've spent my whole adult life, at least, if not even longer than that, kind of almost in the desert when it comes to politics. Right. I was raised in a household that was more Democratic. I had other family members and friends who were Republican, kind of wafting back and forth, because I had things in my life that I agreed with on the left and things on the right. And I just never really found a home anywhere. So I gave up on politics for a number of years. Eventually, probably in about 2012, I almost turned my back on politics completely. But then I started discovering people who were in the Libertarian Party. I started investigating a little bit, but then I would, life got in the way. And then, kids got in the way, careers. And then I would back off for a while. But then I started doing a deeper dive as time went on. And very similar, in about 2016, it really caught my attention what was going on in the U.S. and with politics. And I realized there's no way I could be part of either of the left or the right party. And that's when I started doing a deeper dive into libertarianism. And actually, I just recently threw my head into the ring, I guess you would say, as a libertarian. So I'm still a fairly new libertarian. Now, as far as my faith goes, that's actually even more convoluted, if you will. I was raised in a Catholic home. Didn't really stick. I liked things about the religion, but we never really seemed to practice religion. It was just we went to church, we did the holy holidays, and that was about it. No one else really seemed to act or behave like, say, Jesus would.
Right.
So because of this, I always kind of found myself distant. Now, I went through most of my adolescence and early adulthood being irreligious, but always having a draw towards the Bible, always having the draw towards wanting to attend a church. And then finally, when I was about 28, 29 years old, I started to attend a church. And then that's when I was just encapsulated with it. I was around a lot of people who have been walking with Jesus for decades, pastors and teachers. I found myself in a very fortunate situation where I was surrounded by a bunch of mature Christians who were able to help me understand things and answer questions. And because of that, I became a full-fledged Christian, I would say, when I'm about 29, 30 years old, and I haven't looked back since. Now, as far as my podcasting goes, I do a show about libertarianism. It's a once-a-week show, but again, this is a show designed to go into doing a deeper dive of what it means to be a libertarian, because I know even I have many questions. And the more libertarians I meet, the more I realize we all have differing opinions. There might be a basic set of tenets that we kind of believe in about self-ownership, personal responsibility, these sort of things. But there's a lot of gray area. And because of that, I know there's a lot of room for a lot of wiggle room, if you will, to discover what it means to be a libertarian.
Yeah, I was going to ask, was your show, is it a learning process for you as well? Because you mentioned that you're a fairly young libertarian, so this is you exploring your views through these shows?
Absolutely, 100%. So, I mean, there's things where I've, just started the podcast about 2 months ago. And I mean, before then, like I said, I was doing a far deeper dive about, a few months before that. But there are things that I'm learning that I didn't know, and not that I even fully agree with either. I mean, there are things within the libertarian platform which I understand where they're coming from, but I can't 100% support. But I support 98% of the platform. Right. That sort of thing. So there is a lot that I am learning as we go along.
Yeah, and so Q, what's the rough sort of topic? What's the rough area that your show is exploring then in terms of libertarianism? Is it everything, or is it just having a bit of banter between the guests, or what do you tend to explore in your show?
We're a variety show, actually. So we we want to just talk about everything, man. We go into whatever we can and find a libertarian angle on it. We just recently recorded a show on a debate, basically, about bottom unity, and whether right and left libertarians could ever get together, get along, and unite to kind of like from our perspective, get rid of the state altogether, but from a minarchist perspective, perhaps just limit or minimize the size of the state, right? So, so we did a whole debate on that, and later today, actually, I'll be having a conversation with Lynn Ulbricht. I don't know if you're familiar with Ross Ulbricht and his story with the Silk Road, but we'll be talking about. If you hear a dog barking in the background, I do this in the living room, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah. But I'll try to mute my mic when I'm not talking to keep the background noise to a minimum.
Don't worry.
Yeah. So you might hear my dog in the background.
I mean,
barking,
I'll be honest with you. The whole concept of left libertarianism makes little to no sense to me, purely because I guess the left side of things by nature involves state control. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah. So there's a lot of varying arguments. One of the things that we found in the discussion was. A lot of the words that are being used had different definitions based on who's using them. Right. Like, from my perspective, private property is an inherent unalienable right. Like if I have private property, it's mine. I own it. And there's a whole lot of discussion about what private property actually is on the left. For me, it's anything. Except for another person, right? Like every human being has the right to self-ownership, so I can't own another person, right? Like, and nor would I want to, but but then so you get to the left and you start talking about private property versus personal property, and people would argue that land is rent is theft, land ownership is theft, and so you're right. It kind of gets a little convoluted right to left on who believes what.
Yeah.
But if you're like an anarcho-communist, I guess maybe which I'm not one, but or a syndicalist or some of these other flavors of anarcho, whatever, right? And this is like on the extreme. This is on the extreme bottom end of the libertarian spectrum, right? So, right or left, of course. You could make an argument, or at least I could make an argument of why somebody would want to get together with a bunch of friends, pool all of their resources, go buy a piece of land somewhere that's their property and live communally, though within the bounds of their own commune, so to speak. They could have whatever communist life they want. Now, the market guy in me goes, okay, you're going to last about 6 months. You're going to find out that nobody wants to work because everything's free, with quotes, right? What's free, and then you're all going to be starving, and you're going to ask for help from the market community right next door.
Right. Well, and this is the thing. I mean. To me, whenever I hear especially Christians talking about Christian views on socialism and even communism, I think to me, my theology would sort of dictate that can't really work, merely because we're all flawed and sinful. Therefore, if you go by a system that involves sort of willful generosity and giving of your stuff to help the commune or to help society, then that's not really going to work, because there's always going to be people that abuse that just by nature. We're sinful and have a sinful nature, and there's always going to be abuse of that system. So to me, it doesn't really make sense on how that works, especially sort of theologically. If you think of, I guess this is a more Calvinist sort of view, I suppose, of humanity, but I guess just from having a sinful nature, is it really feasible to trust people to be able to operate a system like that, especially on the bottom left of things?
Yeah.
Because you can, the sort of top left, you can maybe understand because it's not voluntary at all, really, but I don't know if the bottom left really could work, when you think of it theologically almost.
You'd have to have everybody operating in an altruistic, mindset, right? And that we just know that doesn't happen. And even, if you're a Christian specifically and you look at some of the parables, right? Like, just out of thin air, the Good Samaritan. Here's a guy that voluntarily was acting of his own free will, of his own good nature to help somebody else. There was no state coercion to force him to do that, right? So, but that's one person. And then you look at the parable of the talents, right? The three servants, one got 5 talents, one got 10 talents, one got 1 talent, right? The guy that did nothing with it and just kind of like buried it and held on to it to give it back to his master. Well, he was the wicked servant. But the 2 that actually multiplied their talents through, and this is a little bit of speculation, but through market exchange, right? Through, trading of goods and services, investments and things like that. Well, they were the favorable servants, right? And so now this is a little bit of a stretch, but I don't think much of a stretch. I think that shows a market leaning of Christ, Now I'm sure. Now the greater lesson of that specific parable was about your spiritual gifts and your talents that you have to minister to other people.
Yep, and resources.
But your resources, right? So, but it shows an investment mind, right? And I think I think that shows a little bit of the heart of God, at least from a voluntary market exchange perspective. I could be wrong. But that's just that's what I read in it. And I try when, like I'm sure both of you guys, or at least when I try and read my scripture, I try not to do it I try to be objective and try not to make the scripture fit my personal view, because let's be honest, just like you said, none of us are righteous. We're all sinful. And my personal view could be very flawed. And that's why I need to read scripture anyway. And to help that kind of wash over me and cover the way and cover me and my sin and help me understand how to operate in this dark world. And frankly, it's why I need a Savior to begin with.
Yeah, Kevin, do you see a faith justification for some of the things you've ended up believing, or did faith play a part at all in your journey of discovering libertarianism and how you fit into that spectrum?
Well, yeah, actually, the thing is, and I'm going to steal a quote here from C.S. Lewis, because I love him, and he's got a lot of great quotes, but he said, I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And that to me is kind of just a motto of my life ever since I became a Christian, ever since I started following Jesus. I've realized that not everything is the way the world wants it to be. And not everything should be the way that many people in the world, in the secular world, want it to be. And as someone of faith, of someone who follows, Christ, someone who tries to study the Bible, put my life into that path, I've learned that philosophically, when it comes to my political philosophy, I have limitations on what I can and can't support, right? So again, perfectly speaking about like the Libertarian Party, right? I love the Libertarian Party 98% of the time. Obviously, I have problems with the Democratic Party, I have problems with the Republican Party, but when it comes to the Libertarian Party, I respect and agree with most of it. But say, for instance, they have a stance on abortion, right? Now, their stance on abortion might be a fairly neutral one, about as neutral as you can be. Basically, the way that it's written out in the party platform, it says something along the lines like, that everyone needs to decide in good conscience what they want to do, and the government should have no role. And I agree with that 100%. But as someone who is feels as though I am connected to, the kingdom of heaven and God and Jesus, I feel that I can't be quiet on certain things, especially something that might go against teaching of the Bible, teaching of my faith, as well as, for argument's sake, in my opinion, abortion it violates the NAP, the non-aggression principle, because we're talking about another person inside of inside of another person.
Well, this is the perspective on whether an unborn child is a human life really plays a gigantic part in how you view abortion as a principle of liberty, really,
Mm-hmm. So, 100%. And I understand there are going to be people who are not inside the faith who will just think that a baby is just an inconvenience at this time, or not a baby, but an unborn mass of cells, a fetus, if you will. Even though, of course, fetus means unborn human offspring, but still, that's besides the point. There is, it's just the idea that even within the Libertarian Party, again, not everyone is going to have a religious faith, so I understand that not everyone agrees with that, but I have trouble supporting it partially because I'm a Christian, but also partially because of the fact that I do believe it violates the NAP, because life is life, and that life is independent. I mean, we now know thanks to science, we now know that when it comes to an unborn baby, isn't just a mass of cells and one day it's born. We know that there's a development period. And we now know that by 10, 11, 12 weeks, an unborn child has fully formed body, 2 arms, 2 legs, 10 fingers, 10 toes, independent heartbeats, its own blood type. You know what I mean? It's its own being. So because of that, you know, I find myself sometimes at odds with certain people within the Libertarian Party, again, just from the NAP, the perspective, as well as in addition to the faith issue.
Yeah, it's I mean, people kind of lump the abortion question in with things like gay marriage and drugs, in terms of things that are that were considered taboo topics but now are being explored. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good way to look at them, because I don't think they're necessarily equivalent in terms of I guess you could say victimless crimes. You know, you could say that gay marriage and lesbians getting married, that is what you can consider that a victimless crime. You might not agree with it spiritually, but it doesn't really affect too much. People might argue that it affects society's fabric in certain ways, but all in all, it doesn't affect me too much what someone else does in their bedroom or in how they get married or whatever. Same with drugs. I mean, there's obviously different categories, but you could look at marijuana and see it as something that people can do in their own home. It doesn't affect too many people in most cases. But when you look at abortion, I guess if you view that the unborn child as a human being, then I guess you're kind of compelled to make the case that is its own distinct person with its own distinct rights, and how, like I said, how you view that fetus really it changes a lot in how you view things. Because if you see it as not being a person until it's born, then obviously you can have the view that it's pretty disposable. But it's interesting to talk to people about their reasoning behind it, because for a long time I just stayed silent on the topic because I didn't really want to wade in where I wasn't really an expert. But I like to hear other people's perspectives and what they think on this. But would you agree that they seem to be lumped in as the same issues in terms of rights? But in your case, obviously you believe that that's a very distinct issue to talk about, really, abortion.
Well, sure. I mean, I understand why people would or could, conflate all those issues together. But if you really think of it, those issues, like you said, are about the individual. So when someone wants to take drugs, it's about them taking drugs. If someone wants to do something which I believe might be against the Bible, but they're doing it, it's their conscience, it's their issue. That's fine; they can do that. But when it comes to an unborn child, again, that's an individual that's apart from the mother. The thing is that most people realize or believe or under the impression that when a baby is forming, it's got to be about 40 weeks before it can be born. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. But we now know and have proven time and time again that we can actually deliver and save a baby as early as 20 weeks and do it fairly consistently. So at what point is it no longer part of the mother? At one point, it's either it is or it isn't. So I believe it's an independent being, personally speaking. But again, with those other issues, those are people making decisions for themselves. And I do fully respect that there are people who will look at a pregnancy or a woman has a choice of it's her body. And I understand where they're coming from. I just don't happen to agree on a philosophical level or physiological level.
So do you believe then that in terms of politically that that you can almost agree that people have the right to do it, but you can't stay silent on it? Is that where you're at? Or would you say that you're a vocal opponent of that being considered, as part of the party platform?
Right. I do agree that people have the right to do it. It is legal. I don't encourage people to get one. I don't believe it's the right thing to do. If you come to me, I'm going to tell you that, but I'm not going to stop you from doing it. It is legal. Maybe one day, if enough people change their mind and decide that they don't want to do it anymore, don't want to have it to be an option. And again, I used to work in a hospital. I used to work in surgery, and we did a lot of quote unquote abortions, but really they weren't. There were what's called D&Cs or dilation and curettages, or ectopic pregnancies. Now these are obviously either pregnancies that have already ended and they're just being removed, or an unviable pregnancy. But I can understand, when you speak of a medical issue, that someone would have to get an abortion. I understand that. I understand that you will have people who will make an argument saying, well, if it's before this time, it doesn't really count because, it's not really anything. And I understand where they're coming from. I just don't happen to agree. And again, I wouldn't stop anyone at this point. Again, it is law, and I think it should be legal and it should be safe when people get one. I mean, it's kind of terrifying to think if we went back to the 1960s and people were having back alley abortions again, how many people would die. That being said, you can keep it legal all you want. I just think if enough people understood what was going on, understood the process, they would hopefully not want to get an abortion.
And do you not think then we're compelled to make the case for the unborn as if it was an act of murder? Because if you think of it, if you're thinking of that unborn child as its own distinct person, what is the distinction between the killing of that person and the killing of another random person on the street? So why should one be legal and one not?
Correct. No, and absolutely. I mean, I don't think any of it should be legal, but considering it is, I can't stop it. Right. That being said, I do advocate for promoting laws that would prevent it. Mm-hmm. But again, this has to be a choice of enough people. It can't just be me and 10 friends telling the whole world you can't do this. If we get enough people on board, if we get enough people to understand what an unborn baby is, if we get them to understand what is going on, I personally feel convicted to advocate for, passing laws eventually. But again, we're not there, not today.
And I'm not. I'm sort of playing a little bit of devil's advocate, although maybe that phrase is slightly ironic in terms of this conversation. But I'm not going to say my personal perspective because I'm not really sure, other than I don't think it's right. I'm not sure exactly where I fit on the legal spectrum of what should be legal and what shouldn't and what should be available. But I'm trying to tease out really where you stand on this. So I'm not. I'm only sort of challenging you on this. But Q, what's your opinion on all this topic?
well, I'll tell you. There's a couple different issues at play with this particular topic. One is rights versus responsibilities. And so without a doubt, 100%, I believe in 100% bodily autonomy of the individual, to include the decision whether or not to engage in activities that have consequences. And so you choose to do drugs, you deal with those consequences. You choose to drink and drive, you deal with those consequences. And in which case, if you kill somebody behind the wheel because you are driving recklessly because you're intoxicated, you deal with those consequences. If you choose to have intercourse, you choose to accept those consequences. Rights and responsibilities. And maybe some people will look at that and go, okay, well, I'm a guy, right? What are the consequences for me? Well, the consequences for me, and this is, I chose this life, so this is a decision that I made with my wife. We're married happily for 22 years. We have 3 kids. I just sent one to college. I have 2 daughters and a son. My oldest is a girl, is a young lady. I'm sorry, she's in college, and I've got another one who's a sophomore in high school, and a boy now who is in the 4th grade, right behind her. So, I look at that from a perspective of a father, and how do I raise my daughters? How do I raise my son? Rights versus responsibilities. Certainly, they have bodily autonomy, and they can do whatever they want within the reason, within the confines of not causing a victim. Right.
Right.
They have to square that with their God. We're talking Christians now, right? So if they're going to go off and be promiscuous or have unprotected sex or do things that are going to present the situation where they are now with child, well, that's a responsibility that they take. Mm-hmm. That child that they made through the reproductive act of intercourse didn't have a vote in being created. They didn't get to say, "Hey, I want to be here." They just became.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They're just here, and so now there's a contract there between mother and child. She created this child. She's responsible for the life of this child up to the point to where this child can take care of itself. That's my perspective.
And this is what you would say is a moral contract, I guess.
this is an implicit contract. I would say that this is a contract between mother and child, and for that matter, between father and child as well. It takes two to tango, right? So that's an unpopular position a lot of people would take. I'm very pro-life, and I look at it obviously from a biblical perspective, from a moral perspective, but also from a legal perspective. Like anarchy doesn't mean no rules; it just means no rulers, right? So that's a spectrum of libertarianism that I'm at, is 100% liberty. But yet, at some point, you have to deal with the responsibility, and we're never going to get there if we don't recognize the fact that liberty is a two-sided coin. You have freedom and rights on one side, and then you have responsibilities on the other. And when you do something that creates a person, you're responsible for the life and welfare of that person, up to the point to where that person can take care of itself.
Yeah.
But then, like we said earlier, like I believe earlier, the state has a monopoly on violence. And so when you say there ought to be a law, what we're saying is you ought to be able to put somebody in a cage for doing X. So should I believe that somebody who has an abortion be locked up in a cage for that action? No.
Okay.
But I also believe that I shouldn't have to support them in that action. I shouldn't have to. Remember, I'm a voluntarist. I believe in voluntary human interaction, right? So if this person is going to abort their child, maybe I don't want to affiliate myself with this person.
Right. And
that's kind of where I'm at with it.
My question was, I guess, as a natural follow-on question to when you were talking about it being a contract. My question was, number one says who, and number two, so what? So if you say this is a contract between mother and child, if we believe that child has a moral value, or a value in terms of it being a person, as you consider yourself a libertarian, how would you then what are the consequences of just going out and having an abortion? Should there be any consequences?
Well,
or
I alluded to that earlier. It's like I don't think the state should lock somebody up.
Yeah.
Right. For that. But I also don't feel like we should have to tolerate it. I'm not gonna, if I know somebody or I'm aware of somebody who's being reckless in that behavior, then why would I, why affiliate myself with them?
Do you believe there's any lock-upable offenses?
Yeah.
So when you say about the state,
well, when there's and so so, I mean, maybe. So crime and punishment, right? So that kind of mindset. So we should be looking more towards, restoration of the offense. Yeah. So where there's a victim, somebody should receive restitution, right? So if you've killed somebody, then the restitution or the restoration should be geared towards the people who are left behind, family, close friends. Hard to do that. Hard to say what that is with an abortion.
That's
right?
true.
Because the family and close friends would be, well,
the perpetrator,
the one who's perpetrating the crime, right? With quotes, right? The crime itself of abortion. So how do you make mom whole if she's the one that's exercising this action? So that's where it kind of gets sticky, and it's not clean, right? A lot of these liberty things are very dirty when you get down into where do you draw the line and rights versus responsibilities and man, you asked a blanket question. Are there lock-upable offenses? Yeah, there are. What are they? Well, who's the victim? Right? That's the first question you ask. Is there a victim? Well, then now we can start going down that road. Is how do we make the victim whole? And in almost anything else, murder gets sticky because obviously the victim is dead, but you leave behind a trail of other victims. Yeah. Theft is very clean, right? You stole something from somebody, so you repay what you stole. Make them whole again. So it's some of these things get pretty sticky. So that's a good question. I don't have a clean answer for.
Well, let's roll it back a bit. So I'll go to you, Kevin, on this first. So let's talk about then the state. So we're talking about, I guess, punishment for crime. But if we talk about the role of the state in general, what would your opinion be on the existence of the state? And I'm guessing you probably both will have slightly different perspectives on this. But Kevin, what's your perspective on that question?
Well, as being someone who was, born and raised with a state, it's kind of hard to imagine not having a state at all, right? I do support, ultimately, at some point down the road, a voluntary society. I think that could eventually be achieved, but in my lifetime, I don't believe that's a possibility. I believe we should be taking the steps to work towards that. So, to begin with, we should start pulling back the rights of the states of overregulation, having, I can't even tell you how many agencies are within the U.S. government that are absolutely unnecessary. And even things like, things that they shouldn't even be dealing with, like the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division shouldn't even exist. Things like this. We have to start peeling these things back layer by layer. I think eventually, even within our lifetime, within my lifetime, I believe we could get to a point where we are almost like a minarchist society, where we are night watchmen, right? We have a society in which there is a government that exists, but only for the purposes of protecting us from outside forces and essentially protecting us from each other. We'll have court systems, some police to enforce these laws, but beyond that, there wouldn't be a whole lot. I don't think we need them involved in our schools, for instance. Like, some people may or may not know that in the United States, we have a Department of Education. I'm older than the Department of Education. So obviously, for many years, we were able to do it without. We don't need it now. There's too much control. There's too much micromanaging by the federal government, and it does nothing but screw everything up. I mean, there's really no easy way to put it. There's no purpose for the government to be as big as it is. It needs to shrink, not by half, but by tenfold at minimum. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the way we're going, I don't see that happening.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in the UK where I'm in, everything is, we've got the National Health Service and pretty much everything is a state monopoly. I don't even know, private schools is a very sticky area. I'm not even sure if I know of that many of them, only a handful. But when I think about, I was thinking about Obamacare, and when that whole thing came out, I just thought, how on earth is this a good idea to have such a massive, federal program for healthcare when sometimes even states can't even decide among themselves, what they want to do in their own state. So how is it a good idea to have a federal health program? Because not everyone just has different views. The states are too diverse, and I think there's so many different views. And that's the same for education, really. If one state wants to teach creationism for whatever reason and another state doesn't, then why should there be sort of a federal curriculum, that's standardized among all the states? It's too big a level. And this is the same really for the EU. That was our version of, I guess, what you could say is United States. Our federal government for a while was the European Union, and I'm personally glad to say the UK is leaving, but it's the same thing where people in Bulgaria have a vote on what the UK does. I think Bulgaria is in the EU anyway, but the point being that they have a vote on what we do with our own fishing waters. Why should someone in Slovakia be able to tell someone in Northern Ireland where they can fish? It's just it's crazy. But so how you would say things like the Department of Education, even the Department of is there a health department as well? Obviously, I'm assuming how do these things even operate? When there's such diverse opinions within the government. So this is my question, and I don't know if there's any way that we'll be able to see these things start to be rolled back, but I'm not sure if it looks good just based on the way things are going at the minute, like you said.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, the thing is, they don't even know what they're doing half the time. I mean, there are organizations, and then they create organizations to watch over the other organizations. And the problem with
committees.
The way we are, at least, yes, with the way we are in the U.S., the problem with it is that everyone thinks they have the answer. So they want to get in power, and they're going to start giving you the answer, and they're going to put their solution into place. The problem is when they leave office, that solution doesn't go away. And then we just keep adding to it and adding to it. And now we've gotten to the point where no one even knows what anything is going on. There are, especially with the COVID-19 going on right now, right? We have people demanding that the federal government do certain things which aren't in their power. And we have other people on the state level who are demanding like citizens demanding the state do things that aren't on their power. And no one seems to know who's in control of what. And it's complete chaos. I mean, it's gotten better now as time's gone on, obviously. But originally, for the first 2 months, it was literally chaos here when it came to deciding who was in charge of what, who could say what, who could imply, put restrictions on or recommendations on. And it's just proven that obviously the government's too big. The question is, how small can we get and how quickly can we do it?
And I guess the shame of local governors that they all they all looked up at Trump to see what's the president going to tell us, what's he going to tell us to do? And that's, it should be considered, by default that they're in charge if the federal government hasn't told them otherwise, not that that's right in the first place, but they all seem to immediately just look up like lemmings, really, just at like they were sheep. What's the government going to tell me to do? What am I going to be told to do for my state? And I guess it's a shame that was the way things kind of panned out. But it was crazy to see from over here even how that was handled, because at least, rightly or wrongly, you could say in the UK the Prime Minister just kind of says what to do, and the Health Minister just tell everyone what to do, and there's a clear message. It gets a bit sticky in terms of devolved governments, in terms of Northern Ireland having its own rules and Scotland having its own rules, but all in all, the Prime Minister tends to set the policy for the country. But how then would you say that the COVID thing is being handled a bit better now on the whole? Have people kind of figured out what's going on?
Well, I don't know if people have figured it out. I don't know if it's handling better. I think people are just so tired of it, they don't care. So they either go along with things they don't care or agree with because they're just going to do it so they don't have any problems. And then other people are seeing signs that things seem to be dissipating. Some things seem to be improving. People are able to go back to school. Sports are starting. So people are feeling some sense of normalcy. So because of that, I think that's just more of a feel-good type thing. It's not necessarily a better thing, but sometimes that's what you need in a situation like this, is you need people to feel better or feel like things are improving, just because that way their attitudes will change. And once attitudes change, then other things can change. Now, I'm someone with a medical background. I'm someone who's actually worked on a pandemic before, back in 2009. When I was in healthcare, I was in infection control. I was actually on a regional-wide portion of the National Task Force. So I have inklings of what's going on, and I understand why things are being done. The problem is I don't agree with most anything, and the problem is it doesn't seem like anybody agrees, because everyone's getting their information from different sources. You go to a news media, they're saying one thing. You go to your state government, they're saying another thing. You go to the federal government, and in the task force with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx was saying one thing, but yet your county, like I live in by Chicago, we have a very large area, and we have obviously the politics are very large here, and in Cook County we have health department that are saying something contradicting the governor, which is contradicting the federal government. So it's like no one knows who to trust. No one knows who to put their value in when it comes to an opinion, or how they should behave, or who they should trust. The problem is with all this is it was avoidable. And again, what got in the way was politics. Everyone had an agenda. Now, may it be I'm on the Democrats and I want to get Trump out of office, or it might be I'm a conservative and I want to make our Democratic governor and mayor look bad. I mean, who knows what everyone had their own reason behind what they were doing, but politics got in the way, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's going to dissipate anytime soon, especially with a presidential election coming up now just in a couple months.
Yeah. So I'm going to pass over to you, Q, then. So if we go back to in terms of the role of the state, then what would your opinion be on that question?
For what the state should do
in general. So we got a little bit sidetracked there in terms of talking about health particularly, but when we talk about these departments, health, education departments, and all the other ones, ATF and
torpedo them. They shouldn't exist at all. In my mind, the highest office in the land should be like your local mayor, right? Like everything else should just be. And that's just because of the community that you live in. You want to elect somebody to help kind of manage some of the day-to-day details. But
is that in terms of the highest office that you should have to deal with, or the highest office that should exist?
That should exist. Yeah.
Oh, so the president is out then?
Oh yeah, the whole federal government, get rid of it, dissolve it. States, lines, boundaries, borders, it's all imaginary, right? So, it is.
Yeah,
we're all playing a game. We're all playing a game. So. Now that leads up to a lot of questions, and it comes down to rights and responsibilities, right? Everybody has rights and everybody has responsibilities, and you have the responsibility to defend yourself, defend your community. You have a responsibility to work with each other in in a nonviolent way, and if that can't be achieved, then you have the responsibility to walk away or defend yourself if it becomes a problem. So there's a lot of details that go into that, and a lot of questions that can't necessarily always be answered cleanly.
Mm-hmm.
But I go back to slavery, right? People couldn't imagine who was going to pick all the cotton if we didn't if we abolish slavery. Like, I can't, like, if you own a plantation, you have all these acres and acres of tobacco and cotton,
Mm-hmm.
and you have, for lack of a better word, a stable of slaves that just go out and do the work for you. Your entire economy is based off of slave labor. It's going to be hard for you to imagine how you're going to get all of this cotton picked
Mm-hmm.
if I don't have slaves doing it. So there's always going to be a question, and arguably the greatest question is who's going to pave the roads, right? We always hear that one. What about my roads? Everything is like that. It's like, well, I don't know, but there's a market, and somebody will come up with a great idea. And maybe we don't even need roads. Maybe we don't even need a Department of Education.
Mm-hmm.
You look at how some of these kids are raised. We're basically turning over our future to the state, and then we want to know why we have these blind loyalists to the crown, so to speak, right? To use an old, American, colonial term, right? So we have blind loyalists to the crown because the state is training them to be that. I'd like to see it all go away. How do you do that nonviolently, dude? I don't know.
So
I don't have an answer how to get there, man. I just
the next question is if you have I guess this is all it doesn't really make sense anyway in terms of how we've got to the situation, but I'm thinking of like Pearl Harbor. If something like that happens and a kind of malevolent rogue actor, a nation of another country just goes and bombs, rural Missouri, is there any, in your mind, justification for a kind of grouping together of these states for common defense?
Oh, absolutely. We should cooperatively defend each other, absolutely. But so going back to Pearl Harbor, right? I'm glad you brought it up. There's a quote that was attributed to the Japanese admiral at the time. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. And there's some debate of whether or not he ever said it, but the premise is true. We cannot defend the American mainland because there's a rifle behind every blade of grass, and that's to me that's it. That's the answer, right? Like, be able to defend yourself, be able to defend your community, be in a close relationship with your friends and your allies, and live peaceably amongst one another. And if there's something going on that isn't right, well, maybe we need to take care of it.
Well, when you think of the battleships and the aircraft carriers, then do they get built in a cooperative society?
So you had private. So going back to the American Revolution, you had private people owning warships. Right. You had the privateers, basically pirates.
Yeah.
Defeated the British Royal Navy.
This is true.
So I mean, it's not like it's unheard of, my man. So it's unheard of
in a modern world. I guess is where I'm going with this. Is it as feasible today as it was back in? And I guess it's wrong to say those sort of ships were primitive, but in more primitive compared to today's society. I mean, I guess when I think about it, the market tends to produce better solutions than government ever could. We'll probably end up with supercharged, aircraft carriers that can fly if we left it to the markets, to be honest. But
so like you already have a fleet of ships that are owned by private organizations, right? Your shipping companies and all these other guys.
Yeah.
The U.S. government doesn't own Matson, right? They don't own Young Brothers. They don't own. These are just ships that come out here to Hawaii, right? Like so, there might be a corporatist agreement between these, the corporation and the government, and that's a whole different episode. I'm sure we could talk about that. But you already have private ownership of ships, big ships with lots of capabilities, but they're built without defensive measures because that's just been outsourced to the federal government. It's not as if we couldn't do it. It's just that we're not doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I hear people talking about how even people like Mark Zuckerberg and such are in some ways menaces because they have such power and they're not accountable because they're private people, private corporations, I guess. But when people talk about even censorship on YouTube and things like that, then or Twitter, the next question is then who regulates those kind of platforms? And I guess the same would be if someone became then too big for their boots and had this, it was in charge of a massive sort of cooperative military service, then is there, I guess you're kind of ending up in tyranny, and at that stage, whenever the private organizations will get so big that they effectively become the state.
Until there's another private organization that competes.
This
right?
is true. Yep, free market.
Yeah. So that's at least the theory, right? And it works. It's worked for a while in a couple different areas until the monstrosity of the state comes in and takes over, of course. So you kind of go in this back and forth. It's like I think it comes down to just freedom, right? You just be free to live. Excuse me. You're just free to live, and then let those voluntary interactions work themselves out. And in a market environment, if somebody becomes, let's say, McDonald's owns all of the beef, well, we just stop eating beef, man.
Well, this is what I was going to say. My last sort of tangent question was going to be, are monopolies possible in a truly free market? Do monopolies come round that often? Or if they do come round, then is there any way of busting them, so to speak?
Yeah, the theory goes that a monopoly can exist outside of government because there's always going to be some sort of competition, some sort of differentiation in that market that either cripples a monopoly or the monopoly cripples under its own weight, right? Or crumbles under its own weight. And,
and I guess a world without patents obviously helps with this.
Yeah. Yeah. That intellectual property myth, right? That whole thing. That
myth. I like the way you put that.
Well, no, I mean, because, it's backed up, it's propped up by the government, right? So, if you don't have intellectual property rights, and you look at, so there was this big deal not too long ago about the EpiPen. Well, who's that company? I don't remember what it was, but it was the EpiPen auto injector that went from being for people that have allergies to things like peanuts and bee stings and things like that. They had this auto injector that jacked up the price because they were one of one and they could do it, and everybody was so mad, and they're like, oh, look at the free market, except for the fact that it wasn't a free market. This company existed because it was supported by the government, and it was allowed to do that because there was no competition. And I don't know the details, but it was like, I'm just going to grab a number. It was like $30 an injection today, and then tomorrow it was like $5,000 for an injection, and it was some ridiculous inflated price because he was able to do it. But if you had a natural competitor that said, oh no, we can't do that because we'll lose our business, right? We have to be more competitive. Then
it's the equivalent of walking to the next store along and saying, well, can you do this for this price? Yeah. Kevin, you're a medical man, so you might have perspective on these issues of healthcare, but I remember this guy Shkreli, or Martin Shkreli, was that his name, that jacked up the price of a particular drug, and then it went up 1,000% or something. Well, I remember that being a fairly big deal, that people were saying this is why we don't want a free market, because someone can turn a pill that was $2 into $9,000 or something like that. Did you see, Kevin, from your experience in healthcare, ways that it could be improved by the government sort of stepping back and getting out of the businesses of the hospitals?
100%. So just actually to the point that Q is making, that is the problem. The government picks winners and losers when it comes to pharmaceutical products. They're with the patents and with just their ability to be able to produce things and generics and who's allowed to and who can and can't get approval for things. That is what's limiting everything and causing, like you said, these people to become more or less monsters and being able to take money from people who can barely even afford it. Now, there can be some good things when the government steps in, like recently the U.S. government basically lowered the cost of insulin. But again, that wouldn't even be an issue had the government not been meddling in the first place and allowing, other manufacturers to be able to produce these things. I know many people believe that, for whatever reason, that without the U.S. government, there's no way that we could survive. There's no way we could thrive in the world and the marketplace. I don't know where people get this idea from. Maybe it's because they're so ingrained in just living this life over the years and maybe for their entire lifetime growing up in this system. But to the point when it comes to medical purposes, and it's not even just pharmaceuticals, it's equipment. I mean, there is techniques that take 15, 20 years to get approved by the FDA that could have saved tens of thousands of lives had they just allowed people to do trials earlier or to put it into the marketplace earlier. I mean, I've worked with companies that were trying to work on tumor treatments. They had developed a tool that they thought worked well. They had done trials. They had 98, 99% success. And the FDA said, we'll review it again in 5 years. And yet they weren't allowed to do it. And this happens all the time in medicine. It comes with therapeutics, again, with medications, but just even techniques to be able to use certain things. Most people don't understand, like in a surgery, you can't teach certain things in a school until it's been approved or for a certain amount of time. There are so many restrictions in medicine. It would frighten you if you actually knew, at least in the U.S., how it is. I don't know how it is in other countries. I know that's another reason why some people in our country travel to other countries for treatment, is because those areas will allow doctors to perform certain procedures that aren't allowed in the U.S., even though it's perfectly safe, perfectly fine. But because of the red tape, because of the things that the hoops have to jump through to get things approved, it takes forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, coming from a country where the NHS is king and private hospitals are almost unheard of in the UK. They do exist, but very few people will choose them unless they're wealthy. There's a huge movement, especially in the unions, to they're trying to fight against privatizing the NHS. They call it, making it less and less government and more private companies. And I never really understood what they were talking about when they said about this being like a great evil of the world, that privatizing healthcare would be so terrible, because I thought, well, if the government's at the minute employing people to cook lasagnas in a restaurant, like, is that the government's business really? Whenever someone, like, could they not outsource things like this? And it's baby steps, especially where the government is everything in terms of healthcare here, really. So obviously, an ideal scenario would be maybe where the government is just not involved in hospitals at all, you could say. But in terms of, like, why is the government hiring chefs? Why is the government hiring cleaners? Why is the government hiring people, to do maintenance in these buildings? Why is this not all already outsourced to private companies? And I never really just got this movement with the healthcare unions in terms of they're against privatizing healthcare, because they claim it'll lower the standards of treatment, and it'll mean that people then will have to come in and I see at the minute where it's sort of single payer healthcare system where it comes out of your taxes, so and everyone just pays basically it just comes out of your tax percentage. But they say, you'll have to come in and then you'll be charged for your treatment and all these things. But at the minute, I'm not that happy with what I am being charged for, because at the minute I'm being charged for a lot of treatments that I don't want to give my money towards. People are going in and having cosmetic operations that effectively my tax money is paying for. So I never really understood this privatizing healthcare as being a bad thing, to be honest.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, and even then, in the United States, insurance is king when it comes to healthcare, right? The problem with that is that even in the insurance industry, the government is meddling too much and picking winners and losers and allowing certain people to thrive in certain areas and restrict people. Like, we can't get insurance over state lines, which is the most ridiculous thing in the world. We're supposedly the United States of America, yet if I want to work with an insurance company in Indiana or Wisconsin, I don't have that opportunity,
Really?
even though it would save me tons of money.
Really? I've never heard that.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
No, that it is. You can't get insurance over state lines. You can't get insurance over international lines, obviously, as well. But we should have an open market where I can compete, or I can work with people to compete with being able to get insurance from a different area. Now,
what's the argument against that? Why would that be limited?
It's all about control. It's all about that way they can limit what can be covered, what can't be covered. On the state level, they have more control over it. It's a matter of keeping things more organized, as they argue, but really it's the exact opposite. And really it's just a control issue again. Whenever the state, or may it be on the state level or the federal level, get a new power, they're not going to release it. So they're not going to open up, themselves to be able to lose control and to lose power and to potentially lose money.
Yeah, this is true.
Wasn't it Mark Twain that said something? Maybe it wasn't Mark Twain, but he said something like, "There's nothing in the world more permanent than a temporary government program."
Absolutely.
Yep, I agree with that.
Well, look at the institution of the income tax in the United States. Back I think it was like 1913 under Woodrow Wilson. He promised there was going to be a 1% tax on the top 1% earners only and forever, and that's how they sold it. But obviously that was never going to be. but that's the way it is. And that's the way that it always is with the government. Anytime you have the state who wants to either increase, like even right now, I'm in Illinois. We are in the midst of, on this ballot, we're going to have a potential amendment to the Illinois Constitution that will basically allow the Illinois government to raise taxes at will without residents' votes ever again. And I can guarantee you, I'm in a blue state. They're going to approve it. I almost
crazy.
guarantee it.
Well, I don't want to pick on Illinois specifically, but I think you guys have got a lot of problems at the minute. I've seen even the mayor of Chicago is an absolute mess in terms politically and just what's going on. And I guess this leads on to things like riot control. I was having an interesting conversation with someone on Twitter that one night just about in terms of how does without the federal government intervening then in the current situation, how does the president clamp down on rioters and people that are causing unrest in cities? And we're having an interesting conversation about that, but it would be interesting to hear your perspectives on that. I'll even go to Q on this. What's your perspective on these kind of this controlling this kind of civil unrest that's going on everywhere at the minute?
Yeah. Property rights, man. You should be able to defend your property. And if you got riots going on in your neighborhood and, riots come walking down, my street, my property, I don't ever want to, I hesitate to say what I would do because it gets recorded and soundbited, yeah. Right? But, I have tools at my disposal. And I think everybody should have those same tools at their disposal to protect themselves and their property. And you look at where these riots are not occurring. They're not occurring in places that have a high gun ownership rate. Well, I don't know how else to say that without sounding too, nasty.
Maybe
right?
We can talk a little bit about the Second Amendment and why. Because some people will say that, again, coming from a UK perspective, that it's crazy how many guns there are in America, and especially they talk about this how it's almost the Christian wing that's more into their gun rights and stuff. Mm-hmm. Is there any conflict at all between gun ownership and this kind of I guess it's a violent industry, but is there any conflict between that and your faith at all, in your opinion? Do you defend yourself?
There's going to be. Because you look very clearly in the Ten Commandments and all that stuff, and it says thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill, right? There's a heavy responsibility that you take on when you squeeze the trigger in anger, and that's I don't know how to say it. So you first of all understand that every human being is made in the image of God, every single one of us. And so when you squeeze the trigger in anger to put down the image of God, right? Even if that image of God is doing some nasty, evil, horrible things, you're going to have to explain yourself. There's going to be a day of reckoning, so to speak. And I think every Christian probably inherently knows that. But the right to life is the right to life. Life, liberty, and property. Like if you see somebody that's threatening somebody else's life, somebody else's property, and you can solve that problem without killing that other person, then absolutely you should do that. If that squeezing of the trigger is the last resort, and you have to do that, and you have to. I mean, you have to. I think. But that's got to be the angle. It can't just be a bunch of guys walking around. I mean, and just who's going to enforce it? I don't know, but like it can't just be a bunch of macho morons walking around just brandishing weapons all over the place, thinking that that's not going to elicit some sort of response, because that also elicits a response. Now it's not necessarily violent, but you're portraying an image that I personally wouldn't have a problem with, because I'm okay with weapons. I have no problem with weapons, being around them and operating them and all that other stuff. But people who aren't educated in that or don't know enough about it and haven't practiced with it, it's going to elicit a very specific response. So your riots aren't necessarily happening in areas where the threat of retribution from the local population is high. They're happening in places where they can get away with it.
Right.
And I hate to say it, but that's saying something. That's something that we need to consider. That's something we need to look at and go, okay, well, Maybe we should limit the amount of gun regulations that are out there. And again, what's the role of the state? The state, there's this whole myth about this social contract, and some people have different ideas about it. But I feel like the state has voided the social contract in a way, if there ever was one. When, the U.S. federal government, the Supreme Court has ruled multiple times that the police are not there to defend you. They don't exist to defend you. They exist to enforce the laws. Mm-hmm. So if the state isn't going to defend me and I need to defend myself, well, then that's what I need to do. And I think everybody needs to have that understanding.
Well, the state has shown themselves to be pretty impotent when it comes to this, because we've seen, and I heard in the news there that there was a certain action that the president took in order to start prosecuting some people on a federal level that were being let out by the local DAs and prosecutors and things like that. But we saw that people were just getting picked up and then let out again, and people were saying the governors were telling certain areas the police need to stand down and let people just burn a life's work to the ground, and it's obviously shown that there needs to be at least some kind of threat of retribution for when you do that to someone. It makes sense to me that there would be a deterrent that people would that people could possess in order to stop that from even happening in the first place. But it's an interesting sort of conversation, and I'm not sure exactly what.
No, yeah. So the question you asked was, is there a conflict between my faith and taking a life? And there absolutely is a conflict, and there necessarily should be. Mm-hmm. There should be a conflict there, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like you
right,
should.
Yes.
You should not take that lightly. Absolutely. But then there also needs to be an understanding that there are ramifications for your actions. And if you're going to come into somebody's neighborhood and you're going to loot and burn, there are ramifications for that action.
Yeah, so when you say there's a conflict, are you also saying then that there's a justification in circumstance, or are you saying that conflict means that there's no circumstances where you should end up having to take a life, or are you saying that it would be sinful to take a life in circumstances?
Well, yeah, so we live in a fallen state, man. There's a lot of conflicts, I don't know how else to answer that question. If this was the Garden of Eden before the fall, we were all living, in a perfect world where there was no sin and there was no problems, with regard to this stuff, then we'd be having a different conversation.
Yeah. Well, the reason,
there is a conflict, but absolutely there is a reason. There is potentially in this fallen world a reason why you might need to take a life to defend the life of another.
And the reason I ask is because
unfortunately,
I'm friends with a lot of people who would say that there is no justification. And I had someone actually on the first episode of this show that was very much pacifist and said there really is no justification for taking a life in any circumstances. And in some cases that does, they would say that, I don't know if Alex, who I had on, would necessarily say this, but I do know people that would say, even when it comes to self-defense, you shouldn't even kill someone in that circumstance. If someone comes in brandishing a gun into your house to kill your wife, then it's not. Some people would say it's not justified to act in that circumstance, and I'm not sure I agree with that, because just from my views. But Kevin, what's your opinion on this self-defense and gun rights?
Well, I think everyone has right to defend themselves, and very much in the same way that Q was saying, it is something you wrestle with to an extent, because you have an instinct naturally to want to defend yourself. I was raised in a country where people are promoted to defend themselves, but then as a follower of Jesus, I wouldn't want to necessarily do it. That being said, in the moment, I have a feeling I would. I have friends who I've known for a number of years who would have told me that when we talked about this exact subject, they said, well, if someone came up with me with a gun and pointed at me and they shot me, I would just go to heaven. So I really wouldn't care. Now, I understand where they're coming from. I mean, I think ultimately that's what we're all going. So, but that being said, in that moment, if someone has a weapon or a gun or is threatening me or my wife or my family, I have no doubt I would defend them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not.
I don't know how I feel after the fact, but in the moment,
I'm
I
just
have no
not
doubt.
sure that there is a moral problem with that, though. I think when it comes down to which is the loving action, to see someone slaughtered before your eyes or to prevent that happening, and it raises sort of questions about the greater good and things like that. You know, it naturally leads on to those questions, but I'm just not sure that people make the argument about Jesus saying, you know, those who live by the sword will die by the sword and things like that. But I'm not convinced that that necessarily applies in cases of self defense in a lot of circumstances, because I don't quite see how it could be the loving action to not defend someone that was, you know, their life was in danger. You know, so I'm not really sure where I stand on that.
Right. I fully agree. I mean, I fully agree. Like that's what I was saying. I know many people who say different, but I just couldn't stand by and watch someone I love, someone I care about, or even just someone I know be attacked and have no one come to their defense. I mean, even if I didn't have a gun, I might pick up another weapon. Might be anything. Who knows? It might just be my fists. But I couldn't stand idly by. And maybe that isn't, you know, quote unquote, very Christian. But but to your argument and to even Q's argument, I think it is. I think you can't just stand there and watch someone you care about be hurt when you can do something to stop it.
And you talked about the ATF earlier as well. In terms of federal regulation for firearms, what level should that be on? Should there be regulations for particular? Should people be allowed to own machine guns? I hear a lot of people saying about people shouldn't be allowed to own semi-automatic weapons, and I'm like, so that's pretty much everything, so it doesn't really make sense. But some people tend to think semi-automatic means you're capable of mass murder, but I don't know. Anyway, an M1 Garand is semi-automatic and it doesn't look that scary. So,
right.
Anyway, so the point being, at what level should these regulations should there be any? Should they be enforced?
No, there should be no regulations. I mean, when you look back through our history, I'm not saying every person should be able to own a tank, but I'm not saying that they shouldn't be. When you look back at the Revolutionary War times, a lot of the cannons that were used by people in the states or in the colonies were privately owned, right? Even in the Civil War, people had privately owned weapons that they used. Why does it matter if one gun will shoot faster than the other? They're both still going to shoot. So either they should be legal or they should not be. And it shouldn't be up to the government to tell us what we can and can't own, how many we can own, how much ammunition we can buy. I mean, I personally am not even a gun owner, but I have many friends who are, and I see the hoops you have to jump through to even just purchase a gun, let alone the harassment they get or the threats of, well, it also depends too. Like where I live, again, we have a lot of regulations. We up until a number of years ago in the Chicagoland area, you weren't even legally allowed to own a handgun. They actually had to sue and then go to the Supreme Court for them to overturn that. But again, you go right over the border into Wisconsin, they have open carry. So it's, you know, night and day difference depending upon where you live. But generally speaking, I don't think the U.S. government or any government for that matter should be telling you can and can't own something. Even if you're a convicted felon, once you've served your time, you served your time. Once you're back out on the streets legally, you should be allowed to own a gun. So I don't really believe that there should be any restrictions, generally speaking.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear your perspectives on this, because I come from somewhere where nobody owns guns. The police barely even have firearms in the UK. I think the Northern Ireland Police is pretty much the only police service that actually carries a gun on them, on their person when they're on duty. So it's we come from very different worlds in that regard. But as soon as I was saying this to someone on Twitter in a comment, but as soon as I moved out into my own place, when I got married, I immediately understood why people want to have the ability to protect themselves. And it's weird. You almost feel powerless when you have your own home and you don't have anything to defend yourself with. And I'm envious of people who do get to live in society where that is possible. A lot of people will try to argue that Christians shouldn't own guns, but I'm just saying that my instinct would be, yes, I feel like I would like to have one in the house for protection. That's just it's strange you coming from a society where there are no guns, then immediately to feel like, oh, I kind of wish I did have a gun. It was an interesting sensation.
Absolutely. And actually, that reminds me of an interesting comment I heard. I think it was yesterday. I can't remember who the person was. I apologize. But it was on television. They were talking about this situation about guns in the U.S. And they were saying that some people feel comfortable owning guns and some people don't. But technically, everyone in the U.S. owns a gun. And they clarified this by stating that those of us who actually don't possess the gun, our guns are the police. You literally call 911. You tell them to show up with their guns, and they bring your guns for you.
Right.
And they're the ones who use them. So essentially...
And you've paid for that gun with your taxes.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, I'm not saying that's the way things should be, but I'm saying that's the way things are.
And when seconds count, that gun is only minutes away.
Exactly. No, I fully agree. No, but I thought it was an interesting concept.
Well,
that way people would look at that as being like their gun.
Oh man, it's crazy just to hear the calls of defunding the police, and then I don't know, they're going to send a social worker out to your house to try and, I don't know, it's like almost like talking about a hostage situation. You have to send someone to persuade someone not to shoot you. Like, this doesn't really make sense to me at all. I don't understand this call to defund the police. Q, I think I saw that you were an ex-military man yourself. I mean, you might have interesting perspectives on these things, but it doesn't make sense to me, this whole idea of defund the police and get rid of protectors,
Well, it's an incomplete thought. When most people say defund the cops, defund the police, there's an incomplete thought there. They don't finish it. They don't take it all the way through, because there does need to be somebody, to keep some sort of order in the area. Again, anarchy means no rulers, not no rules, right? Mm-hmm. So there needs to be some level of order. And so if we're going to defund the cops, you're not going to get a lot of argument out of me on that, but there needs to be a completion of that thought. Then what? What is that? Right. What do we do then? And social workers aren't the answer, right? So it's the ones who want to defund the cops the loudest are the ones who want to, disarm the people the most, right? Yeah. So it's like it's an incoherent. It doesn't make sense. There's no completion of thought. So that's kind of where I'm at on that. And as far as being a veteran, yeah, I was in the Navy for 13 years, and I did 4 Western Pacific deployments, and I've been all over the Pacific and Indian Oceans and seen all kinds of things. Been into the Middle East, Persian Gulf, Horn of Africa. Anti-piracy interdictions. And incidentally, my last deployment we were on, we shot 17 Tomahawk missiles into Yemen. And there was no declaration of war. There was no military thing that was going on there. There was no operation there. We let the Yemen Air Force take credit for the strike. And that was when I started thinking, maybe there's something else here that we're doing. And because we knew about, I remember September 11th like it was yesterday, and so I was all liquored up on that whole idea of if you're not with us, you're against us. I told you I come from that whole line of thought as far as being neoconservative, right? But that was, I would say, probably the beginning of it. Is I remember being on watch, running the engineering plant, and bringing the electrical plant up to a condition to support a missile strike. And thinking to myself, okay, we're about to do this, and it happened. And thinking to myself, we're nowhere near Iraq. We're nowhere near anywhere that we should be shooting anybody. Right? We're out here to protect the shipping lanes from pirates. Off the Horn of Africa, Somali pirates, and all of that. So then we launched 17 Tomahawk missiles into Yemen. That's not what. We weren't here for that.
Yeah, that's what we signed up for.
Yep. What's that all about? So honestly, that was probably one of the little things that you just, and it's not a little thing because people died, obviously, but these little things in your life, or at least my life, where I just go, when you start seeing the man behind the curtain, so to speak, and you start seeing that things are not what they're supposed to be, or what you were led to believe they were.
And when did you leave military service? Are you still involved?
2010.
Okay.
2010. Yeah, I got out. Stayed in Hawaii. I was, stationed in Pearl Harbor. Stayed in Hawaii, and I work in the shipyard industry now, based off of what I learned in the Navy, of course. And so I fix ships, and that's when we talk about. That's why I went back to, nobody owns the Matson ships, nobody owns the Young Brothers ships, right? These are all private organizations. The government doesn't. That's what I mean. The government doesn't own these ships. These are all privately owned ships that could be outfitted with defensive equipment. But and it was that knowledge that made me think like that. But no, that's being in the military. And I was in the Navy, so it's not fair to say that like there's some guys that have actually been in places and seen some really horrible things and had been shot at and returned fire. And I'm fortunate enough that I've not had that opportunity to have to do that. So I was sitting on a ship, and we launched 17 Tomahawks into Yemen, a country that we were not at war with. So that's the extent. That's the extent of my combat action, of course, and that means that there's been no combat action. So,
Yeah. So were you involved in a mainly? You were saying you're a mechanic. You're involved behind the scenes, really, in a lot of those things. Yeah. So we're saying about it not being a complete thought. What is the completion of the thought in your mind when you say you're not going to argue against defunding the police, but it's not a complete thought? What's your completion of that?
The complete thought is making people aware that they are responsible for their own defense. They're responsible for their own safety. If you're going to defund the police, which it's not necessarily a bad idea, you have to have something else there, right? And because I see the same thing everybody else sees, and there's definitely an increase in police violence, or at least an increase in visibility of police violence. It's either getting worse or it's always been this bad, and we're just seeing it now, right? So with that, it's like we need to do something about it. And if defunding it is the way to go, then perhaps we need to all of us be a little bit more defensive minded.
Yeah.
I live in Hawaii, and so going back to the whole gun thing, right? So it's illegal to carry a weapon in Hawaii, period. In fact, Young versus the state of Hawaii is going to be heard by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals later this month in California. And it's an en banc hearing, actually. So there's going to be a 10-judge panel because the state already lost this in the court. And they've appealed, and so they're going back there. And depending on the ruling, of course, we'll probably see this go to the U.S. Supreme Court. But technically, Hawaii is a may issue state. So if you request to carry a concealed weapon, they may issue a permit. But in reality, it's a no issue state. They haven't issued one since Magnum PI. Right? So
I don't see how. I mean, to me, it doesn't take 10 judges and multiple cases to read really what is a couple of lines or a couple of sentences in terms of keeping bearer arms shall not be infringed.
Correct. Yeah.
That seems fairly self-explanatory. But I was talking last week with I should say on this week's episode that was just launched. I was talking to a police chaplain in Tennessee, and I agreed with him, and I do agree that the police deserve. I would say I'm naturally supportive of a police service in terms of I agree with it in terms of people should voluntarily support a service of men that can protect their community, whether that's run by the state or whatever. That's another topic. But I do agree with the police service, and if you want that police service to be able to do their job well, then naturally you should agree that they should be trained well and outfitted well and paid reasonably well. So this thing of defund the police, to me, makes a little sense, because I think if there is to be a police, which I probably naturally would say, yes, I think there should be, I want them to be a police that is able to do their job correctly. And do it well, and I don't know if either of you guys have any opinions on whether you think there should be a police force or not, or one that's run by the state, but I don't think that defunding them is the right solution, because it's kind of like Obamacare, in that it puts in a sort of half-assed version of a healthcare plan that's sort of neither single payer nor just a free free market healthcare system. It's kind of a weird mixture. So I want it to be done well. If there's going to be an argument for defunding the police, let's have a conversation about it. Let's see what are the justifications, what can be pulled back in terms of spending, or what can be increased even and voluntarily.
Well, about a market-based approach, one of the things that I've often considered is, well, we already have it in place in a lot of places. You get a private security firm that watches your warehouse for you, or your gated community, or your racquetball club or your golf, country club or whatever, or your high school even, right? You have all these different private security firms that go into, they're hired to do this thing, and they all compete for business, right? And so I think you guys even in the UK have a system that's actually working very well, from what I understand. I cannot remember all the details on it, but you have private security firms that are acting as local law enforcement based off of community contracts, right? So imagine for a moment that you have a state monopoly on violence in the law enforcement industry, and you have your rights routinely being violated while cops go up on paid administrative leave, and they come back, maybe they get a promotion, maybe they get fired, but they get picked up by another agency. Or you could have a competing multiple competing firms, so when your rights are violated, you can cancel your contract with this company and renew a contract with another company. Do you think the public will be better or worse served by that? And do you think that would make for better or worse law enforcement agencies? Basically, I think the market has an answer for everything. If you're not going to if you're going to defund the police, why? Let's look at a market-based approach. That's one of those complete. That's what I meant earlier too about like completing the thought. Like, you can. Are we going to just do away? Are we just going to do away with cops?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but what's the answer?
Yeah,
what do you fill that void with?
You can do away with police departments, but you can't do away with a means of protection, really.
Correct.
Yeah. And Kevin, I don't know what it's like in Illinois at the minute with this. I'm sure it's been crazy with. I'm not sure exactly Chicago as a city how it's been affected with rioters and looters, but I'm sure the call's been equally loud to defund police. What do you see? You're in a democratic state. What do you see as being a reasonable sort of next step for people that are interested in promoting libertarianism, in terms of how could the police then be improved upon in a way that could be stomached by people in a democratic state? What would be a reasonable next step? Because you talk about, obviously, this is a multi-generational project that's to move towards a more free society. So what would be then something that perhaps could be introduced in a state like Chicago that people might actually, or in Illinois, sorry, that people could maybe stomach?
It's actually an excellent question. The thing is that, like you said, I am very pragmatic when it comes to solutions. I don't think things are going to happen overnight. That being said, when I've talked to many people who I know who support defunding the police, I understand why they're making the argument that they are. They feel that too much money is being put into policing, not enough money is being put into whatever community development. I understand that. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. I think we could have a free market solution that could work as long as we have policing. But again, it would have to be a switch. In Illinois and Chicago specifically, we have a very dense population. So you couldn't just remove the police. I mean, it would be beyond chaos. It would literally be people dying in the streets, even more so than we already are, because as you probably know, Chicago is pretty well known for shootings.
Yeah.
And our death rates for on the weekends especially. So without any police, that just wouldn't happen. So as far as defunding, I think it's about taking that money and applying it more properly in the police department. Instead of trying to make our police department a revenue generating machine, which is basically what it is. I mean, most people don't understand. Many cops in this area especially, they work under what people refer to as quotas. They're not necessarily quotas, but what you are is every quarter you have a review with your whoever it might be, your sergeant, your superintendent, whoever it might be in your specific department, and you get a review as to how you're producing for your job. Are you running enough tickets? Are you getting enough arrests? And if your numbers are low, you are actually under the threat of either being demoted, transferred, or even terminated. So because of this mentality of we have to produce money, they are doing things that are not only improper but illogical. And on top of it, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but there are a number of prisons in the United States that are private, and they're completely privatized, which in theory sounds kind of interesting because it's a free market solution. But at the same time, the way the contracts are written, they have to actually maintain certain percentages of being filled. In fact, even some contracts that have been agreed to and written, actually the state and or federal government have to actually increase that percentage over a certain period of time, maybe 5 years or 8 years. So our system is not built necessarily on protecting or even enforcing laws. It's about another arm of the government being able to do what they want, control how they want, and make revenue out of it.
Mm.
So because of all those steps that go into it, there is no simple black and white solution. I think you cannot, nor will they allow you to remove the police. I mean, that's not going to happen. They'll allow the conversation to happen, but they won't actually do it because, again, it is a huge revenue generating machine in every major city in the U.S.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I'd never really considered that aspect. Because I know places, was it Austin is going to blow up their police building. I don't know whether that's just a gesture. Obviously, they're reducing some levels of policing, but Austin, Texas is going to blow up their old police headquarters as a symbol of, I don't know what it's a symbol of, to be honest. Lawlessness, maybe. Who knows? But is there like then a step that maybe is not quite defunding the police, but something that would head more towards a libertarian solution to policing that that could be a logical thing that somewhere in between? In your opinion?
Well, I think again over time it would be beneficial to be able to have a privatized and policing force.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that scares a lot of people when you hear that, because when they think, well, private companies are going to start running everything, well, then obviously they're going to become corrupt. They're going to start trying to control things and monopolize things. And that could happen, but hopefully the market would correct it.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, from a libertarian perspective, I mean, again, there are different views on libertarianism. So some people are going to want to have complete voluntary states. Some want, a minarchist state. And again, I come from more of a pragmatist view. I actually belong to the pragmatist caucus. So I have this understanding that baby steps are the important things, as long as we continue to walk in the right direction and never step backwards.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as defunding the police, no, I don't think that's an option. Reforming the police, sure, but again, people can't even agree what the police are even for, right? So some people believe that the police are here to protect you, but like we now know, the Supreme Court has said multiple times that no, they're here to enforce laws. So we have to even get on the same basis and foundation of understanding what police forces are for, and then from there you can build.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Supreme Court obviously operates on a federal level, and the police forces do not generally operate on a federal level, other than really the FBI. So that's an interesting sort of way. How can you sort of reconcile those things? Again, the federal government really intervening in things that they probably shouldn't be. And I know the Supreme Court's job obviously is to rule in these things, but there's too many places, in my opinion, where people are meddling in things that shouldn't be meddled in, and things are going places and reaching people that they shouldn't be reaching at all. I don't want to keep you guys too much longer, but I guess we'll finish on the nice topic of taxation then, I suppose. A nice easy one. So we're talking about defunding then. So is taxation theft in all cases, or what do you think, Q?
Yes.
Kevin? No, expand on that then.
No, actually, no. Taxation is theft, man, and it's one of those things that income tax, particularly, property tax is another one. Sales tax, if you're so what income tax actually is, right? You're working for the benefit of the state to whatever percent. Mm-hmm. Right, to whatever percent you're taxed at, right? So it's not just theft; it's slavery, right? So if you're working for the benefit of somebody else against your will, what is that? And what would you call that? I call it slavery, right? So not only is taxation theft, but income tax is slavery in my mind, at least. So if it's like a 40% tax rate or a 30% tax rate or a 20% tax rate, you're a 40% slave, or a 30% slave, or a 20% slave. So, that's my perspective on it. There's basically nothing the government provides that can't be accomplished through market exchange, that can't be accomplished through voluntary interaction. That's my opinion. And then property taxes are probably among the worst. In that if you own a piece of property outright, but you still have to pay taxes on it, you don't really own that. You're just leasing it from the government.
Yep.
Which means they're your master, which means you're still a slave.
Yeah.
So we can go on and on around this whole thing. It's like there's nothing the government does that can't be provided through a market. Nothing.
Some taxes
Sorry, I
was going to say some taxes can be. You can argue about whether they're right or wrong, but when you think of things like capital gains tax, inheritance tax, I can't look at things like this and logically I can't fit my mind around these in any way that doesn't end up with me thinking that it's just another way for the government to take more money that they don't need off your hands. Like inheritance taxes, that's just we call it the death tax. It doesn't make sense. I just do not get it in any way.
Well, yeah, no, it is. It's an opportunity for the government to get more loot, man, and they will never pass up an opportunity to take money. And if you look at what taxation is, a lot of times they put like a gas tax or a cigarette tax, and the idea is that this is not an original thought, right? You guys have probably heard this before. Gas tax. What does that do? That like encourages people to drive less. A cigarette tax encourages people to smoke less. An income tax encourages people to work less. Like, do we really want to do that, right? So, and I would even make the argument that in the U.S. we have this big push for $15 an hour minimum wage. The only people who really make out on that are the tax people, because people earn more money, they pay more taxes. Ultimately, if you understand anything about economics, at the bottom end you have the minimum wage, which it's all arbitrary anyway. But at $15 an hour, that increases the price of everything else around it, because it's all aggregate, right? The price of a product is the result of all the aggregate input costs, right? So your labor costs are going to increase that cost. So in a very short amount of time, the quick increase in somebody's income is going to be flatlined by the increase in all the costs associated with it, right?
It's sort of inflation, really.
Associated with life around it. Yeah, it's like a backdoor inflation. And the only people who win are the tax people, because they get to tax you more. So,
and the easy argument against this sort of federal minimum wage is if you just expand it to a global level, which isn't really that much of a stretch, because a federal minimum wage is about as it makes the same amount of sense as a global minimum wage, in terms of you could have someone working for basically nothing somewhere like India or in a sweatshop in Bangladesh. If you bump them up to $15 an hour, along with everyone else in California or London, where you have to pay outrageous kind of prices for property, it makes little to no sense really at all.
It makes no sense. Yeah, I mean, why not $5 million an hour? I mean, really.
Yeah. Since
we're being arbitrary about this whole thing, let's. I didn't mean to hijack the topic. I didn't mean to turn it into the minimum wage discussion. But.
That's all relevant, absolutely. So, Kevin, taxation, is it theft in your mind? Would you call it that? Or you're more pragmatic, obviously. What would you say taxation is then to you?
Well, I do agree that it is theft. Okay, first off, that being said, trying to stop the government from taking taxes is not going to be an easy task, and it's not going to happen easily in any way, shape, or form. Any imagination, any stretch of imagination, it's going to be something that might take almost to the point of destroying everything we have in the sense of our government, removing the government to be able to do something like that. Again, I don't know if anyone. I don't know. Some people wish for that to happen, I suppose. Some people don't. Taxes, in and of themselves, at least on paper, don't seem evil. But they really are, because they're taking your wealth away. We can pay for most of these things ourselves. We look at the United States. Most people can appreciate the fact that the United States voluntarily gives money to organizations at higher levels than most other countries combined, after already being taxed. So if we didn't have to actually be taxed, we could take that money and then voluntarily give it for services like policing departments, fire departments, maybe a national defense, whatever it might be. Another thing to think about this is that the U.S. government, or state government for that matter, but we'll use the U.S. government for this example, does not do very well when it comes to efficiency. Recently, most people have probably heard the story about Elon Musk, and he created that, I can't remember the name of the ship, but the ship that brought the astronauts back down to Earth. When this was originally proposed back in 2008 under Obama, they got a bunch of experts together through NASA, and they said, okay, this is going to take about 12 years and cost roughly $36 billion. So Obama said, well, that's great. We're not going to do that. But the one positive thing he did is he did open it up for competition. He said private companies can come in now and try to see what they can do. Elon Musk and SpaceX was able to do this not in 12 years, but in 6 years, and it didn't cost him $36 billion. He did it for less than $1. So because of that, I think even though people have struggled to picture or imagine, the free market or private companies accomplishing the things that the U.S. government does, they can actually do them and probably even better. And there's plenty of examples of that. So because of that, I think, yes, we can get rid of taxes. It's just trying to convince everyone to get on board and say, okay, well, instead, you're going to volunteer your money. But to the products that you think are, to the services that you depend on, the services that you think are important, like your protection or what have you.
And this 3,600% markup really isn't actually that, I think that's the math correct anyway, but that isn't that much of a stretch really, because when you think about it, I at the minute I work as a contractor for the government, like an agency staff member for a government department here in the UK, and I can clearly see, how that's plausible, because when you think of for every dollar that's spent, by someone like Tesla, the government will have hired someone to do sort of evaluations, and you'll have committees going on and people that determine who gets what contract, and people that then have to go and clean the offices that people had those meetings in. And in my work, I work in IT, but when I see the price of a keyboard, for example, is like £96 or something crazy like that, that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with. Or a headset's like £150 in terms of for the government to procure that headset. And this it's not a stretch for me to imagine that at all, that markup. That's probably a conservative estimate, to be honest. So
all right.
Oh no, sorry.
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah.
So like you were saying, efficiency is just not the government's forte. But obviously in terms of taxation, I don't like the thought of it going towards this kind of bloat, and it's really just you're flushing it down the toilet. This inefficiency is just giving money for money's sake, and I think that could be the big thing that has to be addressed in terms of, Donald Trump's tried to make it a big part of his platform to cut the red tape and cut down some of this bloated government. But to be honest, when you sit and reason and think it through, the government probably could be operating on a budget that's maybe a fraction of what it's, a tenth, less than a tenth of what it's, probably way less than that. But even if you just cut out the inefficiencies and take it down to a level that even the current level it's operating, but operating efficiently, you could quite easily, I think, cut way more than half of the government budget, and pretty easily.
Sure, there's a lot of redundant groups within the government. And I actually did a study recently to check to see how many employees actually in the U.S. work for either the state, local, or federal government, and it's essentially 1 in 5.
Wow.
Yeah. Did that study include contractors as well? Because though they're technically private employees, if they have a government contract, they are an extension of that department that they work for, right?
And actually, I don't believe it did include that.
Yeah, and that's probably the biggest. That's one of the big things too. One of the things that you got to remember too is that the government is incentivized to grow, right? Every department in the government is incentivized to get bigger. There's no problem that they come up with that they can't theoretically solve with more people and more money. Whereas when you by their own, in their own mind, right? Mm-hmm. But you look at the private sector.
Just set up an initiative to fix this particular problem,
Yeah, and then you have this whole other department that you have, this whole other thing that didn't exist before, or it's much bigger than it used to be because now we've created this bigger problem.
And really, most of these issues that they're trying to resolve are really the proper place for them is in someone's living room, that they can just sit and talk in the backyard about how their community can be made better. This is what most of these committees and even whole office blocks full of people that really, it should just be people meeting in their backyards to talk about what they can do to fix this particular problem.
So there was I'm sorry about that. So there was a
it happens. I can cut this bit out.
She's a dachshund, and so
we have one as well. Yeah, my mom and dad have.
Yeah, she's a part hound, and so she barks at everything. She's amazing. She's like my favorite child. But
don't tell the rest of that.
They know. But I think there was some bit that was done with Dr. Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell was involved in it as well, in his Free to Choose special that he used to do on PBS way back, was it the early 80s or something like that, maybe the late 70s. And this was in, those dollars, but it was some exorbitant amount of money that was used in a welfare program, where the vast majority of the welfare program costs were in administering the program. So the end user, i.e., the welfare recipient, was getting pennies on the dollar for the cost of the program. And so again, it goes to that whole, not only is taxation theft and slavery, but you're also paying an organization that is incentivized to bloat, right? But if you were to turn it over to a market, a for-profit organization is incentivized to streamline. That's what we're incentivized to do. You don't make money by bloating unless you're in a government contract, and then you make money by bloating because that's what the contract stipulates. Because
and the government are suckers, and they'll just pay whatever you ask them to pay.
And they'll just pay whatever. Yeah. But that's the incentive, right? That's when you incentivize. Follow the incentive.
Well,
you always follow
what is the incentive for the government to grow? What is this incentive? I know they can grow quite easily, but what's the incentive to grow?
Their budgets, man. If you were to look at, like, when I was in the military, when I was in the Navy, every September we were told, because the fiscal year goes from October to the end of September, right? So we were told that if we didn't use all our money, we wouldn't get any more. We wouldn't get this again next time.
Same for us.
So we would be incentivized to find things that we need, even if we didn't need them, right?
Normally in our work, there's a big overtime drive at like kind of May time to start using up all the overtime money that they've hoarded.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's just kind of that's the way it is. And at the end of the fiscal year, they try and find things to blow it on, and because if I can show that, if I'm in this agency or this ship, this command, this department of whatever, and I can show that I have a need for more money and more employees, then I'll get a bigger budget next year, right? And then of course that increase goes into pay raises and other things like that. So that's the incentive because of their accounting practices. Whereas for-profit organizations don't run like that, or at least they don't unless they have a government contract.
So would you consider government contractors then an extension of the government for all intents and purposes?
I would. I mean, maybe they deal with private things like private HR and all that other stuff, but most of these government contracts are de facto monopolies anyway.
The government almost sets up these kind of companies.
They just set them up, and so I would call it an extension. That's why I asked Kevin that question, because that's where my mind immediately went to was, 1 in 5 employees in America work for the state or federal government, but I'm sure it's probably closer to 2 out of 5 if you included all the state, local, and federal contractors.
Well, does the economy crumble temporarily if whenever you think of these contractors that are working for the government and then people working directly in the public sector, how in your mind does the free market then come up with ways to get these people working? And if you think of all these jobs that are just there, just government jobs and government contractors, in your opinions then will the free market come up with solutions? And I'll hear both your opinions on this, but even Kevin, starting with you then, do you see then if these jobs disappear, where does it kind of come from? Where do these other jobs then arrive from?
Right. Well, again, I hate to beat a dead horse, but we can't do things black and white overnight type of thing where you would cut all these jobs and have a huge homeless number, because then all of a sudden they're going to be on welfare and they're going to expand the welfare program. We don't want to do that, obviously. So you have to find a happy medium of being able to almost amortize the transition where you start eliminating certain jobs and then providing free markets in those areas. Now, what areas would you start with? I don't know. That's a great question. I'm not as familiar with all these government contractors. I know they exist, but I couldn't speak to as what areas that they actually cover in, though.
Yeah. No, I suppose I'm not necessarily saying about if we were to cut them overnight, but I guess the natural question people will ask is, well, the government is keeping so many people in employment, and if you were to start cutting these jobs, and where the job's going to come from. But maybe you have a perspective on this, but what would then be the is it just the growth
Well,
of other jobs that then start to figure out the same issues, but without government intervention?
Yeah, so I don't know what the answer is, honestly. I know that it's better to do an incremental approach and go little by little and move in a direction, much like how Kevin was talking. Because if you do anything quickly, you rip the Band-Aid off, there's going to be some pain and suffering, right? Like that's just, so you get to a point where, do you want to do a hard thing now or a cruel thing later? Because ultimately we are going towards collapse. The American economy specifically is going towards a collapse, and since the American economy is going towards collapse, I would say that venture an extension that the global economy is going towards collapse, because it's all based off of the American dollar, the petrodollar anyway, right? So as we're going in that direction, do you want to do a hard thing now, or do we want to deal with a cruel thing later? Because ultimately they're all going to go away anyway. Government's going to fold, these jobs are going to go away, we're going to have mass inflation, mass welfare. So do you want to wait until we don't have a choice, or do you want to try and do something about it? So that's the big question everybody needs to know, or needs to answer. Unfortunately, I don't think that a lot of people are economically literate to understand that that's the question that we're being faced with.
Yeah. Well,
so I mean, I'm one of these guys. Rip the Band-Aid off. It's going to be a rough 10 or 15 years, but we'll figure it out.
Well, it's the same with the coronavirus response. Really, people say
yeah.
about. Do you keep people locked up indoors for 5 years, or do you let people get exposed quickly? Well,
yeah, and it's everything. That's that. And so that's my answer. Is I don't know what my answer is, but I know that the sooner the better, basically.
On that very sunny note, I think it's probably a good time to finish up. Everyone's going to lose their jobs, and it's going to be a rough period of time. The next decade is just going to be hard, but after that, it'll be great.
I'm sorry, bro. I didn't mean to do that.
No. Yeah, and taxation theft, that's another takeaway. So, both of you agreed on that, which is great. So, there you go. But just to finish off then, do you guys want to let everyone know that's listening where they can find your podcasts and your Twitter pages and all that stuff? We'll start with you, Kevin.
Oh, sure. You can actually have a website. You can head over to thekevinleeshow.com. That's thekevinleeshow.com. And on there, I do actually do multiple podcasts. Do the Libertarian Hour. I do the Daily Dirty 30 as well as Whatever with Kevin.
Awesome. And on Twitter, you are?
Kevin Lee Show. Awesome. Or at Kevin Lee Show.
Q, then, do you want to go ahead with yours? Nope. Check it, yeah.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah. So, thanks a lot. I am at Q_abolitionist on Twitter. And I have a show account also. It's at Unshackled_L. So I have a podcast called Unshackled Liberty, and my co-host is Crypto Gumbo. If you wanted to follow him, he's at Crypto Gumbo. And it's just a libertarian variety show. We spend a lot of our time on Twitter mostly, just kind of playing around with the other libertarian types over there, and the anarcho types, and it's a good time. So we love the interaction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show to talk about some of this stuff. So thank you very much.
It's great to have you both. And just to satisfy the NSA who may be watching this, are you affiliated with the Q regime?
No, I'm not, man. So thanks for bringing that up. So that Q is an interesting. I don't know if we talked a little bit about that earlier. I don't know if you caught it on the recording, but Q's an initial, man.
Yep.
Like I didn't think about the impact of the QAnon thing, and I have no affiliation with that whatsoever. That guy's a Fed, anyway.
Well, I wanted to give people a chance to hear it from the horse's mouth before they see you dragged away in handcuffs for being an instigator or something. But anyway, so yes, and I'm at Josh_TTT for the two things you shouldn't talk about podcast, and then I think our the page for that show is at the two things pod, I believe. You can double check it. The link will be in the bio, and I'll link these two guys as well for anyone who's listening. But guys, it's been great to have you on. It'd be cool to do it again sometime, and I'm sure that we barely even scratched the surface of a lot of topics, and we can go in a lot of different directions. But maybe someday, we can do another one, and it'd be great to chat to you again. But thanks so much for coming on the show, and it's been a fun time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Yeah, had a great time.
So thanks everyone for listening, and yeah, until next week, join us again on the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About podcast. But thanks so much for listening. Make sure you subscribe and give us all a follow, and check out all these other wonderful podcasts. But thanks again, and we'll see you next time.